Okay, good evening, everybody. My name is Joe Houlihan. I run the military history talks here at BRLSI with some co-conveners, one of whom is tonight's speaker, which we'll come on to that. As I say, delighted to have you here for the first of three talks about the Korean War. The war began 75 years ago this year, and it was a pivotal conflict with lasting impact for the region and for the world as a whole. It was, of course, initiated by North Korea's Soviet-backed invasion of South Korea and became the first major proxy war of the Cold War. I mean, others, of course, would follow, Vietnam most obviously, but pitting communist forces, North Korea, Soviet Union, China, against capitalist allies, mainly South Korea, the United Nations, and of course primarily the United States. Globally, it escalated Cold War tensions, it prompting NATO's strengthening and the US's commitment to containment as a policy of international order and international way of combating the spread of communism as they saw it. It showcased China's emergence as a military power with over 1 million Chinese troops deployed during the war. The war solidified the division of Korea along the 38th parallel, creating a heavily militarized DMZ, demilitarized zone, and entrenching the ideological split between the North and South that persists to this day. Economically, the war spurred South Korea's industrialization, laying the groundwork for its economic miracle, which again we can see today. Meanwhile, North Korea, the isolation of North Korea following the war, deepened under Kim Il-sung and subsequent leaders. And I don't know if you've ever seen those satellite images of the Korean peninsula at night, where you see the southern half is brightly lit as if it was an image of Western Europe, and the northern half is almost entirely darkness. So the conflict's human cost was around 2.5 million deaths, including 36,000 Americans, 400,000 Chinese troops, as well as around 2,500 from Great Britain and the Commonwealth. This is the first of three talks about the conflict. Next Wednesday, Matthew Holden, who is the chief executive of the Soldiers of Gloucestershire Museum, will be telling us about the extraordinary exploits of the so-called glorious Gloucesters, who held off a vastly superior Chinese force at the Battle of the Imjin River, and their valiant defense there was credited with saving Seoul from falling into communist hands. The following Wednesday, naval historian David Verghese, who's with us tonight, I've seen, will outline the contribution to the war made by the British and Commonwealth navies. But tonight, to explain what led to the war in the first place, I'm delighted to welcome a regular speaker here at the BRLSI. As well as being a historian specializing in East Asia, he has many strings to his bow, including working as a journalist who contributes regularly to the Spectator and many other publications, including leading publications in Europe. So please join me in welcoming Francis Pike.
Thank you for that introduction, Joe. You mentioned the demilitarized zone there, the 38th parallel. I actually went up there once, drove up there to have a look, and I was with a colleague, and you have to go through security checkpoints. And I remember at one point he took out his camera in one of these security zones, and I had dozens of guns, machine guns, trained at me. It was an uncomfortable moment, but that shows in a way what a curious place Korea is, because there are two countries still at war. There's no peace between the countries. It's a country that I found fascinating. I've been to South Korea, 36 times. And when I was living in Japan, I got a call one day from London saying, can you pop over to Korea and advise the Korean government on how to restructure their capital markets? So I spent quite a lot of time in Korea and got to really like it. And it was, I always used to enjoy it because the Koreans tell you what they think. They're pretty blunt, aggressive people. Whereas in Japan, you never knew what people were thinking at all. I mean, they couldn't be more different. I also had the experience of going to North Korea. I was asked to go to North Korea to give a presentation to the Politburo in North Korea on the benefits of capitalism. So, which was a strange gig, to say the least. So I arrived in a room, gave a 2-hour presentation on capitalism. And then question time. And the first question came through a translator. And the question was, what is a convertible preference share? And I thought that was a strange question. And I said, well, before I answer the question, can I just ask, have you even heard of a convertible preference share? You don't have a capital market. And the answer came back, we watch CNN. And this is the peculiarity of North Korean society, is that the people at the very top have access to every information in the world. The people at the bottom, on the lowest rung, they have loudspeakers in their room, and the state can start talking to you any time of day at night through these loudspeakers, and you can't switch them off. Because if you switch them off, you'll go to prison or be executed or whatever. In fact, the person who invited me was the nephew of Kim Il-sung, and who's the founder of the state. And he wanted to introduce the Deng Xiaoping style capitalism in North Korea. But it wasn't very successful. Kim Il-sung was still alive, and I was invited to Kim Il-sung's last birthday party, and sadly I didn't go, which was a shame. But anyway, the guy who invited me, who I spent quite a lot of time with, the following year he was executed. He was put in front of a firing squad because Kim Jong-il, the son of Kim Il-sung, wanted to go carry on the hardline communist Marxist economy style. And so in a sort of power struggle, the nephew was assassinated. So this has happened to a few people I know in Asia. It's a post-war Asian history has been a bit rough. And anyway, what they didn't know, fortunately, was that an intelligence service, which I won't name, asked me to spy on North Korea, which I did for a week. So I got the pleasure of being a James Bond for a week inside North Korea. But anyway, it gives you some maybe idea of what an appalling regime it is in North Korea. And it's a country like no other. I've been to lots of communist countries, and there's no communist country like North Korea. And at night, you walk down the street, there are thousands of people on the pavement, which aren't lit because they can't afford the energy, the electricity. The roads are huge, 8 lanes, and you see a car every 20 minutes. You go to the port there, and there are sort of 3 ships in this huge port. It's a very extraordinary society. But anyway, let's get back to how this all came about. It's really a Cold War story, and I covered it in this book, Empires at War. And the empires here I'm really referring to are the Soviet Empire and the American Empire, and the battle for control of Asia. But it's not quite as simple as that. Some historians, like Eric Hobsbawm, the Marxist historian, see the history of Asia in the post-war period as being simply a battle between Russia, first of all, and America, and then China coming into the equation. But actually, countries like Korea had their own culture, their own momentum, their own political issues. And so the idea that everything was decided by the great powers is not true. It's one of the things that I try and explain in my book, is that domestic issues very often drove foreign policy, which is not necessarily wanted by the great powers. Anyway, this is the book, 900 pages, a lot of work went into it. I'm going to start, hopefully this will work, with Churchill and Stalin and Roosevelt at Yalta. Yalta was one of the big wartime conferences where, and by the time of Yalta, and I'll just move that on, there's another photograph. In February 1945, it was clear that the war in Europe was heading to a win. And so they were starting to meet now to discuss how would the world be divvied up. And at Yalta, mainly they talked about Europe. And Europe was where Stalin really focused and where certainly Churchill focused, and also Roosevelt. And Asia, to a degree, got sort of slightly left out of these discussions. I'm sorry about the rather fuzzy map. And here I'm just pointing out how how Asia looked at the beginning of the war. You had obviously the British Empire was in India, Burma. If this works. Yeah, here's China. The black bits here are where the Japanese had been fighting China to conquer China, trying to conquer China. They weren't doing well, but they'd started the Second Sino-Japanese War, started in 1937. But they were making inroads. They pretty much controlled the coast. They also had Taiwan, which is there. Taiwan they'd taken much earlier in the 1890s, and they made it really a Japanese-speaking place. And Taiwan comes into this story of the Cold War conflict between America and China in this case. And you also have Korea. Now the Koreans had been the Koreans had been effectively conquered by the Japanese. It was fought over. Historically, it had been a Chinese vassal state. But after the Russo-Japanese War in 1905, the peace agreement, basically Korea was allowed sort of first dibs on it wasn't given it as a protectorate or a colony, but it was given first dibs on Korea. And after that they assumed greater power in Korea. So for example, they killed Queen Min. She was murdered. She was dragged out in the middle of the night and stabbed to death. And then in 1910, I think it was, they decided they wanted to go further in control of Korea. And the emperor sent Marquis Ito to Korea, and he went along to the cabinet meeting, and he called out the prime minister and shot him dead. And the cabinet went back into the cabinet room, and they agreed that they would become a protectorate of Japan. So from that point, Japan developed Korea quite rapidly. Most of the industrial part of Korea was in the north. The south of Korea was actually mainly agrarian. That was the food provider for Korea. So the north was the industrial part. It's the opposite of what one might think. So that's giving some historic background to who ran who ran Korea in the interwar period up until the end of the war. Now, I bring in Potsdam here because at the Potsdam conference, the Americans had just exploded the atom bomb in America, in Los Alamos. And so that really changed the balance of power, at least temporarily, between Russia, the Soviet Union, and America. And in a break in the conference, Truman sidled up to Stalin and said, by the way, we've got this quite big bomb. And Stalin took it very calmly and said, great, wonderful. But when he left the room, he immediately told his people to go even faster towards Berlin to get control of the scientists and the technology, because they realized just how important this was. So that triggered, in a sense, the great arms race that we all know about, where they built. I think by the time of the first SALT agreement, that's a strategic arms limitation agreement in the early 70s, I think America had something like 10,000 ICBMs, nuclear weapons, and Russia had 4,000. I mean, it was just an incredible nuclear arms race. So this was quite an important moment. Now, Asia 1945, I'll explain this map. Things look pretty hunky-dory for the West. England controlled India and Burma. China was controlled by our ally, one of the great powers at the wartime conferences. That was the nationalists, or the Kuomintang, which was run by Chiang Kai-shek, who was their leader. So the communists were only really you had Mao Zedong was holed up in quite a barren area in the sort of central part of China. This is where he went to after the Long March, and it was during the Long March that Mao got leadership of the Communist Party, and so he was holed up there. You also had in North Vietnam, you had Ho Chi Minh, who I'm sure some of you have heard of. Back in the day, he was a name on everybody's lips. You may remember marches, rather like the sort of Hamas marches today. There was shouts of "Ho Ho Ho Chi Minh" back in the day. So that was started to kick off the fight for control of Vietnam from the French, because the French controlled Indochina, this area here. So that was North Vietnam. South Vietnam was further down there. Obviously, Japan had been conquered. The Philippines had been recovered as part of the American Empire. It was still an American colony. Lots of Americans you'll meet will say, Americans have never been imperial. What nonsense. Complete rubbish. You also had, down here, you had what's now Indonesia. It was called the Dutch East Indies, so it was a Dutch colony. So they were starting to have fight for independence under the leadership of Sukarno. He became President Sukarno. So there were all these. So on the face of it, it looked quite good for the West, but actually things are beginning to kick off. And what happened? You had the situation where the European empires had really lost power during the Second World War. And you had, at the same time, you had nationalist movements who wanted to gain independence, gain power. And so there was a tremendous power vacuum in Asia. And this is really what the Cold War was all about in Asia, is who's going to fill the power vacuums. I just show a map here. This is actually a map going back to 1890, but I just wanted to show the extraordinary size of the Soviet Union. And when you think, if you take a country like, where is it? Kazakhstan, which is, I've lost it. Yeah, Kazakhstan there. Kazakhstan is bigger than the whole of Europe. So that includes Germany, France, Spain, Italy, Eastern Europe. It's the size of, it is a huge country. Country I know a bit. I used to advise the president there. I just want to show the scale. And the railway was built all the way down to Vladivostok here. Manchuria, part of China, Japan here. And what happened at the end of the war, people think that the war ended on August the 8th after the atom bombs were dropped on Japan. That wasn't the end of the war. The Soviets invaded Manchuria, and which was occupied by the Japanese. So the war carried on for another almost a month after what we think of as the end of the war in Asia. And they conquered Manchuria in about 3 weeks. And then they carried on down into the North Korea is sort of down here, just down here somewhere. So they carried on down there. And there was this was a bit of a shock to the Americans. The Americans wanted Russia to join in the war against Japan. So they didn't want to have to conquer Japan by themselves. And so they were encouraged, but they were a bit surprised that Stalin did it quite so quickly after the dropping of the atom bomb. And the Americans said, well, we've got no plan, because at Yalta, the meeting in Yalta, they'd focused on Europe, but they hadn't really focused on how they would deal with Korea. And what then happened was that literally, after the invasion of North Korea, the two American generals rushed into a room, pulled out maps, and said, how do we divide Korea? And arbitrarily, they picked on the 38th parallel, where even today, that's where the demilitarized zone is. So it was really a rushed job, and it's sort of the classic way that the great powers sometimes divided countries. You talk about Iran and the Middle East also being examples. But that is how things developed immediately after the war. This is again just explaining how the Soviets invaded Manchuria and took control very, very quickly. Korea is down at the bottom there, so they invaded there. So nothing to explain. They then went on actually to conquer Sakhalin Island and also the Kuril Islands, so the small islands that link northern Japan, Hokkaido, the northern island of Japan, Hokkaido, to Sakhalin. Now, the Comintern, just to explain, the Comintern is short for the Communist International. The Communist International was an organization set up to stir revolution throughout Asia, or throughout the world actually. So people like Ho Chi Minh worked with the Comintern. This was before the war, but because the Soviets became allies of the West, they decided they would close the Comintern in 1943. So it was shut down, except it wasn't really shut down. It really carried on, but without the name Comintern attached to it. And after the war, there was a feeling in America that the good times would now roll in terms of the relationship with the Soviet Union. The Americans thought that within a few years that 30% of American exports would be going to the Soviet Union. The reality was that 1%, not 30%, went to the Soviet Union. So very, very quickly, the wartime alliance between the Americans and the Soviets broke down. And that wasn't because the Americans wanted, to carry on some contest with the Soviet Union. It was because the Soviet Union really was fixed in its objectives of global Marxist revolution. And so, I just point out ahead, when Averell Harriman, who was the ambassador, he asked the deputy foreign minister, he said, well, what can we do to make you happy? And this guy said nothing. He just said one word, nothing. And that's because there really was a complete drive from the Soviet Union to conquer the world. And it was a path of world conquest. In a sense, you could say, perhaps it's similar now to how what the jihadists want in the Middle East. They want world conquest. And a lot of people didn't believe this. A lot of people on the left in America and Europe did not believe this was true. I mean, I've met lots of people who still don't believe it's true. But that was the situation. The next thing which became important, and this is the most famous telegram in history, and it's by a guy called George Kennan, who was I think he was the number 2 in Moscow. I think he was the deputy to Averell Harriman. And he sent a long telegram explaining, it's long because it covered pages, explaining why institutionally the Soviet Union was completely committed to global conquest. And there was nothing that the West could do to change that. And that had a profound impact on American thinking, because the Americans had this, dreamy idea that all would be hunky-dory after the war. But it wasn't, because the Soviets were still utterly committed to global domination. And Joe Stalin, he may have been at these meetings at Yalta and at Potsdam, and they liked him. I mean, actually, both Roosevelt and Harry Truman, who came after Roosevelt died in the middle of the Battle of Okinawa, they both, I think they liked Stalin more than they did Churchill. They were they sort of ganged up against Churchill a bit. And they liked Roosevelt, he liked that sort of, that rather blunt, manner that Stalin had. They liked his directness, they liked his bluntness, and they got on very well. But that didn't carry on after the war. Stalin knew exactly what he wanted to do after the war ended. So this long telegram had a big impact on American thinking. So this is just summary. So here it is. In sum, we have here a political force committed fanatically to the belief that with the US there can be no permanent modus vivendi. And it was a brilliant analysis, and it deserved a very famous moment in Cold War history. And then, shortly after the long telegram, Churchill, who's now out of office, because during the Potsdam Conference, elections are held in Britain, and much to the complete shock of Stalin and Roosevelt, he loses the election to the Labour Party in a landslide. And it's Attlee and Bevan then come to Potsdam to replacing Churchill. And although Truman, he didn't love Churchill, but he respected him. But he described Attlee and Bevan as sour pussies. That was his word for them. And anyway, Churchill, with time to think about the world, he went to Fulton, Missouri, and he spoke at Westminster College there. And he gave a speech warning of the dangers, what was happening in Eastern Europe and what the Russians were intending to do. And he made this famous sentence: from Staten in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent. One of the most famous phrases in Cold War history. I'm not quite sure why he chose Trieste, because actually Trieste never got very communist under Yugoslavia. It never became that communist. It's a city I know well. I spent a lot of my summers along the coast from there. And it was never really a deeply communist country. And the result of that was that Truman really changed his stance on how he viewed the world and how he viewed the Soviets. So he made it clear that America would defend democracies. It would defend countries against this Soviet plan to conquer the world. And the doctrine basically said we want free development of kind of self-determination of countries. Now I'm moving on here to a meeting in 1945 between Chiang Kai-shek and Mao. And this is quite important. They'd met once before in 1927. So that they'd met, almost 20 years earlier almost. And Chiang Kai-shek, as I said, was the head of the nationalists in China. Mao was head of the communists. They both fought together, in theory, against the Japanese invaders. In reality, Japan actually did a secret deal with Mao to not fight. So the Japanese agreed not to fight the communists, and they both fought the nationalists. So Chiang Kai-shek had a problem during the Second World War because, first of all, the American general in charge of the armed forces in China during the Pacific War, he wanted to focus on recapturing Burma. And so Chiang Kai-shek was not very well supplied, and so he had to fight both Mao and Chiang Kai-shek. Although in theory, Mao and Chiang Kai-shek were in partnership, but the reality was that they weren't. But they pretended that they were allies. Actually, this was very confusing for the Russians. Stalin could not understand why they were fighting each other, because he saw Chiang Kai-shek as a national socialist, as another, effectively a Marxist. He was actually more pro Chiang Kai-shek than he was Mao. And this was one of the problems in the post-war period, in the Cold War period, is that nobody quite understood what people's motives were. And so you also had the situation where you had a situation where, for example, the Americans, they at one point they were thinking, well, we'd quite like the Mao to take Taiwan, because the Americans hated Chiang Kai-shek. The left-wing Americans loathed him. The right-wing in America, the right-wing Republicans, like Edward Luce, the owner of Time magazine, he was pro Chiang Kai-shek, but the Democrats were very much pro to begin with, very much pro Mao and against Chiang Kai-shek, which is a peculiarity of this war. But so there was a lot of sort of misunderstanding from the Soviets and the Americans about what was really going on here. Now, I'm jumping ahead a little bit too fast, but I'll just explain here. By 1949, the picture here in Asia is completely different to what it was with the picture I showed you in 1945, where the West really controlled everything. By 1949, India was independent and was moving to the left under Nehru, who was a neo-Marxist, effectively. you had China had been completely conquered by Mao in a war with against the nationalists. The nationalists under Chiang Kai-shek had retreated to Taiwan. The Philippines was now being restored to Filipino control, so the Americans had given up their empire. In the Dutch East Indies, Sukarno had come to the fore, and he was a neo-Marxist as well. So if you're sitting in Washington, you start to look at the map, and you think, my God, we had everything in 1945, and 4 years later, we're really on the defensive. And the difference between the two maps is really extraordinary. And of course, you had, by this point, the French were engaging in their war in Indochina against the Marxists, Ho Chi Minh's Marxists. So it was geopolitically for the West, it was a real mess. I put him up here simply because Kennedy, he blamed, Kennedy was a Democrat, obviously, so was Harry Truman, but he blamed Truman for losing China. So even some of the Democrats started blaming Truman's administration for losing China without a fight. And it was very divided. The Democrats were very divided on the issue. Some were very much pro-Mao, and some were against, and Kennedy was obviously against. Of course, Kennedy, in the end, would really start the war in Vietnam. It's often thought of as being a Republican war. It wasn't. It was a Democrat war, very much a Democrat war. Now, I'm just going to look at the sort of three of the main characters in the Cold War background here. Harry Truman, quite a boring Midwesterner, not very flashy. He was a haberdasher. He came from farming stock. He was a haberdasher. He tends to get, I think he was a really good president. I think, for me, he'd been my top group of presidents in the post-war period. But he wasn't a dynamic figure. He was a solid, Intelligent good guy. Mao, I'm sorry. Mao was a peasant. I think slightly above the lowest peasants, but he was a peasant. He was an early adopter of Marxism, but he developed a Marxist philosophy which was very different from the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union, classic Marxism, believed that the economy developed and then the revolution came from within cities. Mao believed you start the revolution in the countryside and you surround the city. So he had a very different idea of how you win a revolution. He was also slightly obscure and pompous. He fancied himself as a poet. He fancied himself as a classical intellectual. He was a historian. He was also a drug addict. He on the Long March, he became addicted to opium. One of the problems with opium is it makes you very constipated, and he would have to stop, and his bodyguards would actually have to reach into his bum to get out turds. He really wasn't an addict. He also became very addicted to sex. Towards the end of his life, he lived in the swimming pool in the government compounds. He more or less lived in the swimming pool and used to invite troops of girls to go swimming with him. The curious thing, at the same time he was doing that, JF Kennedy was doing the same thing in the White House. So explain that if you can. He was also he was a pretty brutal guy. He killed lots of people, not just the enemy. He killed a lot of his own people in constant purges throughout his career. Um, Stalin. Well, Stalin grew up in a place called Gori in Georgia. It's a beautiful area. It's in the foothills of the Caucasian Mountains. I actually drove through there last year. So I've seen where he lived. He became head of the Bolsheviks in Georgia, and then moved to the center and became friendly with Lenin, met Lenin before the revolution in Finland, and moved to the center. And when Lenin died, he took control and there was a troika. There was Stalin, Zinoviev, and Kamenev. And the three of the troika got rid of Trotsky, and Trotsky fled until he was hit with a pickaxe in the head in Mexico. And after he got rid of Trotsky, he then killed off his two collaborators. So Kamenev and Zinoviev were then put in prison, and they were then executed down the line. So he was a pretty brutal guy. Big drinker, lots of vodka. Very opposite to Mao. When they didn't get on, when Mao and Stalin met, Mao kept talking riddles in terms of Chinese history and fables about mountains and so on. Stalin was just a blunt, straight talker. He didn't get Mao at all, so they didn't really get on very well. Dean Acheson, and he's a really important figure in this story. He was quite instrumental in the start of the Second World War, because Dean Acheson was an undersecretary at that time, and in 41, and it was Dean Acheson who froze all Japanese assets in America. So Japan couldn't buy oil from Standard Oil of California, and that was the reason why the Pacific War started. Well, he became Secretary of State under Truman, and after the war, he was optimistic that he could bring China away from the Soviet Union, bring them into the Western camp, and so he pursued this strategy of trying to leverage them out of the grip of the Soviet Union. And the Chinese Communist Party, people would think that Mao was the ultimate dictator. Well, there were other leaders too. Mao wasn't the only powerful person. So Zhou Enlai, who was the prime minister, he was more favorable towards America. And so there was this period when Dean Acheson was really interested in getting China on side. Ultimately, though, it didn't happen. Ultimately, the pro-Soviet people won, because you had quite a lot of people in the Chinese Communist Party who'd been educated, trained in Moscow. So people like Lin Biao and so Li Shaoqi and so on. And they signed in 1950 a treaty of friendship in Moscow. There's a photograph of the two of them together. Mao also signed off an alliance with Ho Chi Minh in North Vietnam. So all these things started to run against America's plan to peel off China from the Soviet Union. So the Cold War problems for America were becoming more and more extreme. And of course, Mao started supplying Vietnam with equipment to fight the French. And famous General Giap, who was the great general who won the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, which is the great battle which defeated the French. He was delighted to be getting equipment from China. And so the key place where people were worried that, rather like today, the place that people were really worried about was Taiwan. Having decided that they couldn't get China on side, they decided they had to protect Taiwan. So they sent the 7th Fleet to Taiwan to protect Taiwan. And actually, this is a running story. We're living this story now. Now, the two main protagonists, and here I'll really come to the internal stuff in Korea, which really. So I've given you the big picture of the Cold War, but it wasn't Taiwan that started the first hot war within the Cold War. The first kinetic war was Korea, and I'll try and explain a little bit about what happened. So the North Korea and South Korea were divided at the 38th parallel, as I've explained. In the north, you had Kim Il-sung, and he's a very mysterious figure. It's very difficult to work out what he was because his propaganda was so extreme that it's very difficult to sort out fact from fiction. If you just read, I remember buying books when I was in North Korea, buying books which basically said that Kim Il-sung had defeated the Japanese, that he was the ultimate military hero. Well, that clearly wasn't true. It was the Soviets who invaded and took North Korea. So there's a lot. He did fight. He joined the Soviet army. So we know he fought in the Soviet army to some extent. He also, to raise money, he robbed banks. He was a tough nut. He also killed his opponents within the Communist Party in North Korea. So he was extraordinarily brutal. And as I've said, this is still the case today, as I said at the beginning with the stories I told you at the beginning. But in some ways, Syngman Rhee, who became the democratic first president of South Korea, he really wasn't much better. He was, he's that old-fashioned word, a nasty piece of work. He was an aristocrat. He came from a big family. He'd escaped from, under Japanese rule, he'd gone overseas to escape Japanese rule. But he came back and won the election to become president of South Korea. He was a megalomaniac. He was pretty keen that the Americans would help him to conquer North Korea. So you have these two guys there who are both pretty unpleasant characters. They both would like to unify Korea. But what to decide, the standard, if you read a Marxist historian like Eric Hobsbawm, he would say, the Korean War was entirely dictated by the Soviet Union and America, which is just not the case. It was internally driven. And Eric Hobsbawm is a sort of determinist Marxist historian. He would call me a bourgeois scribbler. He wrote a book called On History, in which he described people who wrote the sort of history I write. But he writes a sort of deconstructed history where he has a Marxist framework and then fits facts conveniently into this Marxist framework. I think he's a horrible historian. But he made a lot of money. And he helped the Miliband's get into Oxford, which otherwise I don't think they would have done. So why did the North suddenly attack South Korea? Well, a lot of people say, well, that was Stalin who did that. Well, that's not the case. Kim, of course, went to Stalin. He traveled to Moscow to get the blessing from Stalin for the invasion of the South. And Stalin agreed, but Stalin was a cautious guy. And Stalin, he put distance between himself and the war. So he gave them MiG airplane. He gave them MiG airplanes, but he didn't give them. He trained their pilots. He didn't have Russian pilots in the planes. So he was really testing out. He was testing out the West. Would the West really defend Korea? And so anyway, why did Kim was the guy pushing to invade the South. So why did Kim want to invade the South? Well, the reason is he'd been in power for 2 years, and he'd nationalized every industry. He'd collectivized the farms, agriculture. And what happens when you do that? The economy collapsed, as it always does when you get extreme socialist systems put in place. And what happens when the economy collapses under this socialist system is people start to move south. So in those 2 years under this Marxist economic plan, 1 million people just got up and walked south, walked across the 38th parallel and went south. So Kim was facing a situation where he'd be president of a country with no people in it. And this is true of, you can look through history, but you will never find a case where people march en masse from a capitalist country into a communist country. It's never happened. The same thing happened in North Vietnam. Millions of people walked south from the north to the south. In Eastern Europe, people weren't trying to get across the Berlin Wall the other way into East Germany. They were trying to get out of East Germany. And that's always been the case with, the Vietnamese boat people left Vietnam. The Cubans left Cuba. This is always the case. But it creates a problem for the rulers of these countries under these catastrophic economic systems, Marxist economic systems. And so for him, the answer was, well, let's just go and conquer the whole of the South. And that was the reason why he invaded. So this is, it's slightly in the wrong order. It was, but I just explained here that everybody sort of slightly misunderstood what was going on in the war. I mean, General MacArthur, he hadn't worked out. He was in Tokyo running Japan. He was, and so he was slightly too detached. They got their intel wrong. They didn't realize how strong the North Korean forces were, how well equipped they'd been by the Soviets. Syngman Rhee there'd been a border war going on along the 1838th parallel for a year. And he thought he would like to attack the North. That didn't happen. And Mao and Sun, they sort of assumed that the West wouldn't defend Korea. That the West would see it as an internal battle. After all, the West hadn't intervened in China. They hadn't intervened in Czechoslovakia. So this was the first big test, really, of the West's guts. Would they really stand up to the Soviets' plan to conquer the world, to spread socialist, Marxist philosophy throughout the world? And Truman, so much to the surprise of Stalin was shocked, and so was Mao. They couldn't believe it when Truman went all out to help South Korea fight to maintain its independence. So what happened then? Yeah, this is a really strange story, because it wasn't America who fought in South Vietnam against the North. It was the United Nations. Well, why? The United Nations never agrees on anything. So how could it possibly happen that it became a UN force fighting in Korea? Well, the reason was that the Soviet Union had been arguing that with China now conquered by Mao, that Mao and Communist China should have the place on the National Security Council, which Chiang Kai-shek had. But obviously that wasn't agreed to by America. They blocked it. And in a huff, the Soviets walked out of the United Nations and said, we're not going to play your game anymore. So in this interlude, the United Nations then voted that it would be a UN force that would go and fight the communists in North Korea. So it was a weird moment in UN history where something was actually decided because the Soviet Union had taken umbrage and walked out. And the reaction in America was very positive to this. America had been, before the Second World War, been very isolationist. But actually, over this, there was very positive support for Truman's actions to send American forces to Korea. And the same in Britain. And there were a few holdouts. Tom Dryburgh, famously left-wing Labour MP, he used to go to North Korea. I've seen letters he wrote. He was a North Korean shill, basically. He loved North Korea. Michael Foot, but again, Michael Foot, who became leader of the Labour Party, he was against fighting the communists in North Korea. And so the UN, and people tend to think, well, it's just America and a few Brits. But actually, as you can see there, a lot of countries were really worried about the possibility that communism would spread. This was the era of the domino theory. And so you had a whole swathe of European and Asian countries who willingly fought against the communists in North Korea. And I'm not going to go into the war itself because, in the next few episodes of this trilogy that's being done here, they'll explain what happened. But essentially, the Kim Il-sung's armies, they just swept through the South Korean forces. About 40% of them were killed or captured. Syngman Rhee's army were killed or captured. And in the end, they were pinned down to what's called the Pusan perimeter, where Pusan was important because it was the major port of Korea. If you ask me, I'll tell you what happened next. But I think my story is really the origins of the Korean War. So I'm going to stop here and ask you if you've got any questions.
Thank you, Francis. Wonderful talk. If you have any questions, raise your hand. And as always, I would ask you, for the benefit of our audience watching online, if you could speak very close to the microphone, that would be great.
Thank you. Francis, if your lecture had gone better in North Korea, might you have changed the course of history? Had it become a capitalist state?
Well,
was it actually your fault?
So were they what?
Was it your fault that they didn't turn into a capitalist country?
No, I gave a brilliant presentation to the Pope.
Oh, good.
Absolutely superb. But in the end, whereas China is it's a dictatorship of a group. It's more of an oligarchy than a dictatorship. In fact, I've been writing in the last few weeks about how it looks as though in China, the Chinese elders of the party and some generals within the army have actually taken power away from Xi Jinping. So in China, you don't have it's not a dictatorship in the same way as it is in North Korea. In North Korea, it really is a dictatorship of one man and one family. And anybody who's really tried to cross them has been killed. I think my pal he was lucky to get the firing squad, because some of them they put in front of an artillery piece and they get blown apart. So as I didn't get to see Kim Il-sung himself, and I think he was ailing at that point, which is why I think there was this plotting by people around to try and move North Korea in a different direction. But in the end, the family, Kim Jong-il, he wanted to carry on the course that his father had set. So it wasn't me, Tim.
That's good to know. A tricky question. To what degree were the people who you call neo-Marxists and communists really nationalists, using communism as a tool of nationalism? And to what degree were they tempted by Marxism per se?
Look, people may be Marxists, but they're still Korean. They're still nationalists as well. And this is the problem for Mao. He couldn't understand why Chiang Kai-shek and Mao were beating the living daylights out of each other. Because he saw Chiang Kai-shek as a national socialist, effectively, as a Nazi. People forget that Nazis were not right-wing; they were left-wing. Nazi means National Socialist. And I've never understood why the BBC and all the world's media called Nazis right-wing. They weren't. They were left-wing.
The cause of the problem is the division of Korea into North and South. Could you explain in more detail why it was necessary to divide the peninsula?
Yeah, because they were working on the basis of dividing up things. These conferences at Yalta, Tehran, and so on, and Potsdam, and so on. They were divvying up how the world would be divided, and they'd come to no agreement over Korea. Being that wasn't the priority. The Soviet Union's priority and the West's priority was, sorting out Europe. So Korea had just fallen into a hole really and hadn't been thought about, which is why, as I said, there's this sort of episode where two generals, after the invasion of Manchuria by the Soviet armies, two American generals rushed into a room and said, "We've got to have a plan on what we say to the Soviets as to what's a fair division between North and South Korea, because we've got to have our slice, they have their slice, as with the division of Germany and so on." And so that's why it was divided. It was this post-war period where they were divvying up the world.
So there were no cultural or historical reasons for the division?
Not really. I mean, the two areas, in terms racially, they're completely the same, although their language now is separated, diverged quite a lot between North and South. But racially, it was completely the same. The North, as I said, was more industrial. The South was agricultural. But there was no obvious division between the two in any meaningful sense. No.
There was a substantial American presence in Japan and occupation forces after the war. Were there any American troops stationed in South Korea at the time of the invasion?
Yes, so there were some, and they were pushed down into the Pusan, the Pusan perimeter, which is shown there. There was one American general captured. I mean, in the Pacific War, there were 18 American generals captured in the Philippines. But after that, I think it was General Dean, I think, who was captured rather bravely defending a position, and he was captured and spent the war just outside Pyongyang, which is the capital of North Korea.
Good evening. My name is Sophie. I'm from Ukraine, and I
Yes.
have many South Korean friends whom I love dearly. And so my question is, given the agreement between North Korean and Russian leaders signed last year, where they agreed to help each other in their aggression plans, so what are the probability, considering the war against Ukraine, that a North Korean leader will also start aggression against South Korea?
Sorry, it was difficult to understand you there. Joe, did you hear that a little bit better?
Yes, I think the question was, given that North Korea supplied troops to Putin for his war in Ukraine, this young lady's from Ukraine, I think the question is, what likelihood do you think there is of further aggression in Ukraine from North Korean troops, and possibly even aggression into South Korea from North Korean and possibly Soviet, no, they're not Soviet anymore, sorry, Russian troops?
Yeah, that's the question. And some of my friends, they are set to start a mandatory military service in Korea. So, and they are so young and obviously afraid. So they need some encouragement and hope, but I'm not sure there is any. So what is your take on the chances of?
So any words of encouragement for young people in South Korea worrying about invasion?
Well, I wouldn't be too worried about invasion. Of course, North Korea now has an atom bomb, so they could use that. That was provided with technology by A.Q. Khan, the nuclear physicist in Pakistan. So Pakistan provided the technology for North Korea. But obviously North Koreans realize that that they would be wiped out if they started chucking nuclear weapons about. But what it does give them, it gives them ultimate protection. If you've got an atom bomb, nobody's going to attack you. There've been lots of attacks by North Korea on the South. Many episodes where North Koreans have infiltrated into the South and even attacked the Blue House, which is the South Korean equivalent of the White House. They even blew up the South Korean cabinet one time in I think it was in Rangoon, I think, and half the cabinet was killed. The president survived because he was late to turn up to the meeting in Parliament. And after that, you had military curfews in South Korea a lot of time. I used to be in South Korea quite often when there was a military curfew. And so at 10 o'clock at night, you'd have to be back in your hotel, couldn't go out. Of course, I did go out because it was more fun. I used to sneak out with pals, creep in the shadows while the military police went along, and then go to these underground nightclubs where you go through holes in the ground and holes through doors and so on. You go down tunnels, and then you come to this amazing nightclub underground. So I used to do that. And then at 6 o'clock, the curfew was lifted. And then you come out onto the street having slightly worse wear, and you eat kimchi and lots of garlic and Korean barbecue in these little tents on the street. It's great fun. No, I don't think South Korea needs to be worried. I mean, I think the North Koreans, for them, I suppose what they get is they get training. There's nothing trains you better than having to fight a war. So that's why the Koreans have been brilliant at fighting, at learning how to fight, but so have the Russians. And the Koreans are getting practice too about how to fight a war.
That's not an encouraging thought. Okay, I think we've got someone. Yeah, sorry, David, I'll come to you next.
You've described Harry Truman as boring. I saw a story recently on the internet involving him, a piano and a dancer, and I think the answer is that he wasn't boring.
Well, yeah, he was...
But following on the serious question, I suppose, you looked at Asia in 1945, and as far as I can make out from all the reports, the control of certainly the European powers and possibly the US as well of most of Asia was fairly tenuous at best. I don't think the French physically re-entered Indochina for about 5 years, until about 5 years after the Second World War, and probably managed to wind everybody up the wrong way. The Dutch control of of what's now Indonesia was largely enforced by Japanese troops controlled by the British. And of course, we all know what happened to the Raj, which collapsed over a very short period of time. So I think it's a slightly optimistic thing to say the West was in control of Asia.
What I'm saying there is, if you looked at a map, prima facie, it looked as though the West controlled. But as I did point out, that Sukarno was emerging, he was a neo-Marxist, he was emerging in the Dutch East Indies. You had Ho Chi Minh emerging in. So it looked as though the West was in control of everything, but actually there were stirrings here of nationalist movements, which very often the nationalist movements adopted Marxist ideology, because that was sort of in opposition to the Western capitalist states. Harry Truman, I'm saying he was boring, but I mean he was good. He was a piano player. He liked history. He was well read, but like most historians, like me, are quite boring. We're not the most exciting people in the world. But I think he was a great president. Actually, really good president.
Thank you. Thank you, Francis, for your talk. Based upon your extensive experience in both North Korea and South Korea, can I ask you to use your crystal ball for the future and give us all perhaps a view on how you might see future unification of the Koreas? It's been talked about for many years because, as you know better than all of us do, it's only an armistice that was signed, not a peace treaty. And every few years, this idea comes up in the world press and then disappears. What's your own view?
It's very difficult to see how this can be resolved. And it's partly because, he does have a nuclear weapon in the north, Kim Jong-un. It's different with Eastern Europe. Actually, in 1989, I started a private equity company in Eastern Europe. It was the first one ever launched in Eastern Europe. Because I met somebody who told me some things that were going on in Eastern Europe. And I thought, wow, the Soviet bloc's going to fall, it's going to collapse. So I started a business. Even before the Berlin Wall came down, I was visiting, Poland and Hungary and other countries. So I could see that coming. At the moment, I can't see that coming in North Korea. My best guess is at some point there could be a palace coup, that you'll get some section of the army who will suddenly sweep into the palace and gun down Kim Jong-un or his successor. It looks as though at the moment it's going to be his daughter, which would be a new one. But in the immediate term, I can't see anything happening there. But the palace coup is always possible, and to me, that's the danger point in a way, because what you do, you're sitting in your bedroom, you've got the rebels coming to get you outside, and you've got the big red button, nuclear button, by your bedside, and you say, well, if I'm going to be taken out, I'll take the rest of the world out as well. So that, to me, is the big danger of North Korea. So I can't, at the moment, there's nothing that I could foretell. It's not like today, I'm seeing lots of indications that Xi Jinping is being toppled. But I can't see that in North Korea.
Okay, I think we may have time for, is there one final question? Yep, at the back.
Firstly, Francis, I live in Central Europe, and it's Central Europe. It's a very sensitive issue if you live
indeed.
there.
Yeah.
Secondly, I would say to people, if you're passing through Budapest airport, keep your camera in your bag. It's not just the Korean border. I've actually seen a guy recently arrested for taking pictures where it says, don't take pictures. It's unfortunate for a question, I think in 2 weeks' time when I won't be here, and my internet connection is very unreliable in Budapest. My father was supposed to fight in the Korean War. His ship, I think at the time, was the Broadsword, and at the very last minute, they were directed to the east coast of America, and he spent the Korean War cruising up and down the east coast of America. Are you able to explain why that might have happened?
Gosh, no.
Did the North Koreans invade North America?
Look, it may be that because the Americans were sending so many ships off to Korea, that they got some English ships to take their place to do Coast Guard duty off the east coast of America. We actually, during the Second World War, a lot of people don't know this, but we sent an aircraft carrier through the Panama Canal to fight with the American fleets in the Pacific. A lot of people don't realize that. We even, we've repainted it to match with the American ships. They're given American uniforms and so on. And they fought in some of the South Pacific battles. The British fleet, meanwhile, was off first Africa and then India. Eventually, we had, the final battle of Okinawa. We had 8 aircraft carriers at the battle.
And may I just say to the questioner, I don't know if this is the case, but in our third talk in this series about the role of the Navy, I don't know whether your question will be answered, but I'm sure the speaker will be happy to, who's here tonight, will be happy to look into it. Okay, I'm sorry, I know there's more questions, but we've run out of time because the staff have to close up the building. So thanks once again for coming. Thank you to Francis for, I think, a fascinating talk. Thank you to you for some wonderful questions. So a round of applause for Francis again. Thank you.